Baruch was Jeremiah's scribe. Together they lived through the last 4 kings of Judah before the Babylonian captivity took place. And after the captivity, they both went down to Egypt and saw many sad things in those years they had together, both in Israel and in Egypt. But if ever there was a year to sadden and depress the remnant that Jeremiah had, it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim that we've read about in both those chapters today. This was the year that the first captivity of Jews from the southern kingdom was to take place. Jeremiah had begun his ministry in the 13th year of Josiah, and since that time he'd been prophesying destruction, defeat, captivity, the ruin of the temple, and now in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the first captivity of the southern kingdom was to take place. And Jeremiah had prophesied at this stage for 22 years, doom, destruction, and the overthrow of the temple. And there had been no fulfillment in that 22 years until we come to the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Jeremiah had been mocked, scourged, persecuted, imprisoned, and derided for his words. And they came to him and they said, "Where is the word of Yahweh? Let it come now. You're always talking about doom and gloom." And he had made himself thoroughly unpopular. Even his hometown of Anathoth were trying to kill him because of the prophecies of doom that he'd been giving for 22 years. And twice he'd tried to resign. He said to God, "I'm sick of this. You told me it would happen quickly, and nothing's happened." And God always said to Jeremiah, "Get back to work." And so we come to the 4th year of Jehoiakim. It was a year of gloom for everybody, because very sadly, the words of Jeremiah now began to come to pass. There were huge changes on the world scene. Just look at chapter 46 and verse 2. The word of Yahweh which came in verse 1 to prophesy against the Gentiles, against Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates in Carchemish, and Nebuchadnezzar smote in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. So it was in that same year that we read about in chapter 36, chapter 45. These events are all happening in the same year. The Battle of Carchemish takes place. And Jehoiakim had been hoping that the Egyptians would protect them from the Babylonians, who were the rising world power at this time. But the Egyptians were defeated. They went home back to Egypt, and the way to Jerusalem was now laid bare by the defeat of Egypt. And so Nebuchadnezzar just marched in and took Jerusalem. And it was in this particular stage, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, that Daniel and his friends were taken off into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar rounded up the cream of the land, took away the king's seed, and they became eunuchs in Babylon, as had been prophesied to Hezekiah. Jehoiakim was humiliated. This was the first time since the days of Samuel that Israel had lost its independence. Think about that. Since the days of Samuel, when they had to throw off the yoke of the Philistines, it was the first time since that time they had lost their independence. They were now under tribute to the Babylonians. And Daniel and his friends were gone. And Jeremiah's little Sunday school class he'd been nurturing. And I'll talk more about that in the next study. But there'd been a little Sunday school class that he'd been nurturing in Jerusalem, people who would listen to his words. And some of those were now taken away. Daniel and his friends were gone off to Babylon as teenagers from that Sunday school class. It was the beginning of the end. For Judah, there was now only 18 years left before their final overthrow and destruction. So the 4th year of Jehoiakim was not a good year. In that same year, we're going to see that a number of things happen in the record. We're going to see that Jeremiah has his words written out. All of his past speeches have to be written in a scroll by Baruch. So we read in chapter 36, it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim. We're going to see in chapter 25 that in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, as he finished writing out all the past speeches of Jeremiah, he was then going to add chapter 25 of Jeremiah to that scroll. We'll go over that a bit later on. And then here in chapter 45, we have his classic depression that takes place when he's written those words down. So it was a very, very bad year in the history of Judah. Things began to change. No longer could they ignore Jeremiah's warnings. When you come back to chapter 36 and verse 25, when that scroll was eventually read a year later, we find that in chapter 36:25, nevertheless, Elnathan made intercession to the king that he would not burn the scroll, but the king would not hear him. Now, who was Elnathan? Well, Elnathan was Jehoiakim's father-in-law. He was a brutal murderer. He was the man that had murdered Uriah the prophet in Jeremiah 26, who years before had gone out repeating the words of Jeremiah in different places around the land, was hunted down by Elnathan when he fled to Egypt, and murdered by Elnathan and cast into the graves of the common people. He was a brutal murderer supporting the evil King Jehoiakim. And even he is saying to the king, look, I think we should really listen to Jeremiah a bit more. You know, since the time of the murder of Uriah, Jeremiah had been under house arrest. He says that, I can't go out. I'm under house arrest. I can't go to the house of Yahweh anymore. But Elnathan, that ruthless murderer, is saying to the King Jehoiakim, it's time to start listening to Jeremiah. The only person who would not listen to Jeremiah was the evil King Jehoiakim. And when you read about him in Jeremiah 22, God puts a caption on Jehoiakim. He says, from your youth, your policy has been, I won't listen to the word of God. You put a scroll of the words of God in front of me, I'll burn it. And God says to Jehoiakim, your problem is you will never listen to what God has to say. You know, kings like Zedekiah were always saying to Jeremiah, what is the word of Yahweh? Tell me what God said. I want to know. He wouldn't do it, but he wanted to know. When you come to Jehoiakim, I don't want to hear it. Didn't even get the first base with Jehoiakim. And so we read in Jeremiah 36 and verse 5, Jeremiah is restricted. He can't move anymore. He's got to stay at home. He's under house arrest. And so God now brings along another faithful supporter, and it's Baruch the scribe. Baruch only comes into the record of the book of Jeremiah after the loss of King Josiah. And we all might remember how much Jeremiah lamented over the loss of his friend Josiah. You know, we have those terrible lamentations over Josiah in the valley of Megiddo that actually become a type of what's going to happen when the Jews recognize their Messiah in the book of Zechariah. Jeremiah greatly missed his supporter and companion Josiah. He offered many lonely prayers over the death of Josiah, and the replacement that God gave him was a man called Baruch. Who was Baruch? Well, his name means the blessed. He's the son of Neriah, which means the light of Yahweh. He came from a scribal family. His brother Seraiah was Zedekiah's scribe. And when Zedekiah was carted off to Babylon, blind, but carted off to Babylon nevertheless, Seraiah went with him to Babylon as his scribe. So he was from a family of scribes, and he was perceived to be a strong influence upon Jeremiah. Later on, we're going to see in chapter 43 that the people who wanted to go to Egypt, they just said, well, you know, Jeremiah, it's Baruch that keeps stirring you up to do things that we don't want to do. And so they disagreed with Jeremiah and said, your problem is Baruch's a strong influence on you. So he was a strong influence on Jeremiah, and that's how he was perceived. So he was a scribe from a godly family. Later on, we're going to see that he plays an important role in Judah's history. After the city fell and the Babylonians took away nearly everybody across to Babylon as captives, there was left in the land a remnant of poor people, miserable people, with all the ruins of Jerusalem around them. And Jeremiah sat in those ruins, and gave us the book of Lamentations. But the king of Babylon appointed Jeremiah and Baruch and Gedaliah to rule over that city. And it's quite remarkable, isn't it, that these three men were given the rulership and the governorship of the city. And of course, we know that Gedaliah got himself murdered, and they all went to Egypt against God's advice. But he was Jeremiah's faithful scribe and companion until his death in Egypt many years later. So he was a courageous man, a loyal man to Jeremiah. He stayed with Jeremiah through the next 20 years, right to the end of Jeremiah's life. You find him again in chapter 32 and verse 12, when Jeremiah buys the land at Anathoth, and Baruch takes the title deeds of that land and buries them in the city of Jerusalem somewhere. So he was always with Jeremiah right to the end. But let's talk about the writings that he had to do. So he was to write out in chapter 36 and verse 4, he had to write out from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of Yahweh which he had spoken unto him upon the scroll of a book. So he was to get a scroll, and Jeremiah was now going to repeat all the public speeches he'd given up until that point of time. And we believe that encompassed the words of chapter 1 to 12, 14 to 20, and 23 to 26. You're probably aware the book of Jeremiah, the chapters are not in chronological order. You have to sort through the dates and the times given. If you want a chronology, I have one with me. You can copy that and get a copy of how you sort out the chapters of Jeremiah. But we believe at least those chapters up to about 19 chapters, except for chapter 13, which is out of order. Chapters 23 and 26 were the first words written on the scroll. After the king burnt the scroll, he had to do it again. So he had to write this out twice. But at the end of the writing of the first scroll, he added chapter 25. And it was that chapter that threw him into depression, because that chapter was utterly conclusive about how much devastation was coming to the nation and to the temple and to the city. But before we go to chapter 25, I want to just concentrate upon the change that takes place when Baruch arrives. When you read the book of Jeremiah and you put the chapters in the right chronological order, you notice a very noticeable change that happens in the 4th year of Jehoiakim with the arrival of Baruch. Up until this point of time, until the 4th year of Jehoiakim, everything in the book of Jeremiah is in the first person. It's Jeremiah talking about, I did this, I said that, they did this to me, I went there, I went here. So it's in the first person until Baruch arrives on the screen. Then we have a different style of writing once Baruch starts to write the record. You know, in those early chapters of Jeremiah, you have Jeremiah praying, Jeremiah in lamentation, Jeremiah resigning, having a debate with God. And it's a great exercise in the book of Jeremiah to mark in the words of Jeremiah as distinct from the words of God, because there are some interesting debates that go on between God and Jeremiah. But it's all about Jeremiah himself. When you get to the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the record is written as a biography. Jeremiah's life is seen by a close observer, because Baruch was with Jeremiah day by day, sitting alongside of him. And now the record is always in the third person. Jeremiah did this, Jeremiah did that, rather than I did this and I did that. So an interesting change in the record takes place in the 4th year of Jehoiakim with the arrival of Baruch. We now get very specific details that only a close associate would know about Jeremiah. But he also includes in that record his own fears and the time that God had to send a message to him personally about his depression, as we read in chapter 45. Before Baruch come to Jeremiah, Jeremiah had been prophesying alone for 22 years, performing parables, giving resounding speeches all over the land, going to significant places to make denunciations against the kings and against the people. For example, he often had to go to the temple and make a certain speech. He had to go to the king's palaces, both at Beth Hakkerem and the king's palace in Jerusalem, and make certain speeches against the royal family. He had to go to the potter's house and make speeches in the potter's house. In the valley of Tophet, he had to go to certain places and make significant speeches up to this time in that 22 years. But there was no permanent record. In those days, there were no tape recorders. There were no newspapers. The word of Jeremiah had to be passed on by word of mouth, and people soon forgot them. So God now says, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, take a scroll. Look at verse 2 of chapter 36. Take a scroll and write all the words that I've spoken, and look at the against here, against Israel, against Judah, against the nations. These were words of condemnation that Jeremiah had been speaking for 22 years. As we said last night, God always gives his people warnings of impending judgment, and he did that again. Jeremiah was hopeful. Look at verse 7. It may be, he said to Baruch, they will present their supplication before Yahweh and return from their evil ways, because the anger is great that has been pronounced. They were hoping that these accumulated speeches of Jeremiah, being read out in one hearing, would actually have a dramatic effect upon people. And it nearly did, until the king burnt the scroll. But there was hopeful things in this. And I believe Baruch and Jeremiah set off recording these words with great hope in their hearts. And so we know that Baruch wrote down at least those chapters we have on the screen there before you. But it was concluded then with a new speech from Jeremiah 25. And that was the final crushing blow. Let's go to Jeremiah 25. Let's come to Jeremiah 25. This was added. This is why in the book of Jeremiah, you have to always check the date that the chapter is referring to. Jeremiah 25, verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning the people of Judah, when? In the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Okay, so we're right on the spot. The son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's come along and he's taken control. And this is the same year that chapter 25 is now added to all the previous speeches of Jeremiah. Now we know that from verse 13. Look at verse 13. And I will bring upon that with language all my words that I have spoken against it. That's the first 22 years of prophecy. Even all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah had prophesied against all the nations. So you see, Jeremiah 25 was now added to all the past speeches of Jeremiah that had been recorded by Baruch. So it is a chapter of great gloom and destruction. Just have a glance at verse 8 and 9. Therefore, thus saith Yahweh of armies, because you've heard my words, you've not heard my words, I will send and take the families of the north, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, bring him against this land, against the inhabitants, against the nations. So that's straight picked up in Jeremiah 36, that against, utterly destroy them, make them an astonishment, a hissing, perpetual desolation. And you can go on, and the language is all destructive. In verse 11 and 12, a 70-year desolation. They shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years, and this land will remain desolate for 70 years. Verse 12, when 70 years are accomplished, I will punish the king of Babylon. So again, we have the prophecy now of the 70 years of desolation, that they would not be back in that land. Verse 17 to 29, we have a prophecy against the rest of the nations. You know, God says here, look, basically he says, well, look, don't let the other nations mock Jerusalem, because you've got it coming as well. Babylon is going to destroy many more nations than Israel. And so between verse 17 and 29, the other nations get their share of the cup of God's wrath. Look at verse 26. The kings of the north shall come one with another, and the kingdoms of this world on the face of the earth. The king of Shishak shall drink after them. So there was many destruction coming to other nations. And then in verse 30 to 38 of Jeremiah 25, we have a futuristic prophecy of fierce and terrible slaughter in the day when God moves greatly in the earth. The fierce anger of Yahweh at the end of verse 37. In verse 38, the fierceness of the oppressor and the fierce anger of God. And we're talking here about the time when God's judgments will go like a whirlwind through the nations. So it's a chapter of great desolation, doom and gloom and destruction. And that all happened in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. This prophecy was added to the book that was already now written about the past speeches. And that's why Baruch crashed. You can imagine writing out all those past speeches he'd not heard personally, and now Jeremiah's repeating them and he's writing them out. And then there's the new speech, chapter 25, to be added. And when he writes this, all of his hopes and ambitions are dashed because there's going to be a great slaughter. You know, you can divide this chapter a number of ways, but verse 1 to 28 is the current judgments of the nations in that area, including Jerusalem. From verse 29 onwards, it's all the earth at the time of Armageddon. And so at the end of verse 29, I will call for a sword upon all the inhabitants of the earth, saith Yahweh of armies. So that is the Armageddon prophecies that are added at the end of the chapter. But it's all about destruction, doom, and gloom. And this destroyed Baruch. He collapsed. So I want you to come back to chapter 36. This provoked a personal crisis for Baruch. Now, back in chapter 36, we notice in verse 9 and 10 that the public reading of the scroll did not take place for between 9 and 12 months later on. It was on a fasting day in the 5th year of Jehoiakim. Chapter 36, verse 9. It came to pass on the 5th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, in the 9th month. So it's at least 9 months. It could have been as much as 12 months before he got up to read the scroll. So it was in that 12 months. And I suggest it was 12 months because it probably should have been read at the fasting day in the 4th year. But there was a whole year's delay took place before they came to the fasting day in the 9th month of the 5th year of Jehoiakim, before the scroll got publicly read. And that's the year in which Baruch has his classic depression. And we're going to see why. By then, Nebuchadnezzar had come to Jerusalem. He'd humiliated Jehoiakim and put him under tribute. He'd taken away the captives from the Sunday school class. Daniel and his friends were gone. And now nobody is doubting the words of Jeremiah except Jehoiakim. So we want to talk about that 12 months while Baruch is in depression before he gets up and reads in chapter 36 and verse 9. Chapter 45, you want to make a note in your margin, actually slots between verse 4 and 5, because in verse 5, Jeremiah is commanding him to go and to read the scroll. But the collapse that happens in chapter 45 is after verse 4. That's when chapter 25 is written, and then he collapses, and then God speaks to him. 12 months later, Jeremiah then sends him to the house of Yahweh to read that scroll. So coming to chapter 45 then, let's pick up what happened to Baruch. Now, as I said, it's placed between verses 4 and 5 of chapter 36. Just a small correction, when it says when he had written, the Hebrew is actually in the present tense, while he was writing, or in the writing of. This collapse that we're going to see of Baruch's mentality happened while he was actually writing the scroll, and particularly after adding chapter 25. And so what he has is a major depressive episode because of the words he's had to write down. And what God does is to send Jeremiah to him. Let's read carefully. The word that Jeremiah the prophet spake unto Baruch. So this wasn't a direct revelation. God sent Jeremiah to talk to him because he had collapsed when he wrote down these words. Now, why send Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah perfectly understood what it was to be depressed. When you go to Jeremiah 15, you could go to Jeremiah 20. Jeremiah had Jeremiah 12, at least 3 bouts of major depression himself before this. But in Jeremiah 15, he said this, for thy sake I have suffered reproach. He suffered terrible scorn, mockings, scourgings, beatings, being left and ignored. I sat not in the assembly of them that made merry. He couldn't go to feasts. He couldn't go to celebrations. He couldn't go to funerals. He couldn't get married. He was so alone. And when Josiah was gone, he was utterly miserable. I sat alone because of thy hand. He was filled me with indignation. So Jeremiah knew what it was to be totally depressed and downcast and withdrawn. He understood great sorrow. And so God sends him to Baruch. And what we have in chapter 45 is the way that God deals with sadness and depression. by using Jeremiah to do that. Now, let me make some clarifications about what I'm about to say about depression, because I've given this talk a few times before, and I often get criticism about my comments. I was almost banned in one place because someone had heard my talk. Let me say this right up front. I am not medically trained, but we have had some experience with a number of people who have been depressed. We have done research on it. What I want to present to you today is a Bible perspective on this sensitive topic, not a medical one. I do recognise that some depression has physical causes, some requires medication. I am not saying throw out your medications or ignore your medical advice. So please get that clear. I'm not here to give medical advice. Well, let's remember, in Bible times, there was no medication. There were no psychiatrists or psychologists. So depression had to be dealt with by God. And we've got God's way of dealing with it here in Jeremiah 45. Now, God who made us is aware of our human weaknesses and susceptibilities, and he provides ways for us to manage them. Now, sadness is one thing. That comes to everybody at different times. Even Jesus sought to be alone when he heard of the death of John the Baptist. He said to the disciples, "Let us go apart into a place away from the crowds. I need time to go through my sadness and my grief." Later, when the cross loomed before Jesus, it says he began to be very heavy. The weight of the responsibility of what was coming with the pain and the shame depressed his spirit. He began to be very heavy as the cross loomed before him. When Paul was at Corinth, he said, "I was at Corinth in weakness and fear and much trembling." Later, when he was languishing in prison in Rome, worrying himself sick about the ecclesial world, unable to get out and to tackle the problems he knew were happening out there, he was downcast. You've only got to read between the lines in the 2nd of Timothy to see the sadness and depression that Paul was suffering. "Demas has forsaken me. No one stood with me in my last appeal before Caesar. I pray God it may not be laid to their charge." You know, there's a very sad man. "Bring the cloak before winter. I'm cold in this prison." We all have times of great sadness and worry. But depression is something else again. There was a time when depression used to be called a nervous breakdown, and it was looked upon dimly by society. But today, depression is much better understood, and it's actually more socially acceptable than it used to be. But it's a big problem. It's estimated in Australia, 800,000 Australians are being treated each year for depression. That's 1 in 20 of the population. You think about that. 1 in 20 is actually being treated for depression. And of course, the costs in absenteeism and impaired performance are enormous. How is it in an age of so much technology, of labour-free devices to do our work for us, of shorter working hours, where we have no privations like older generations went through, where they didn't have enough food? How is it that in this age with so many conveniences that people are not coping with life? Well, you and I both know there's never been an age so mentally confusing and stressful and time critical. We overfill our lives with appointments and times that we have to meet all the time. It's a technologically confusing age. We have an invasive media that's always pressing at us. Constant change happening around us in society, unstable employment, and we have today the spirit of woke madness descending upon us, especially through the workplace. It's getting harder and harder to be a Christadelphian. The pressures are conform to the woke madness or be cancelled. So we have a lot of pressures, even in an age where we have so many labour-saving devices. Let's define what we're talking about when we talk about depression. What's my thing? Let's define what we're talking about by depression. Depression is a very definite thing that happens to people. Sometimes it can run in families. It can be an inherited susceptibility in some families. But often the cause is not known, and it can come very suddenly to people. It can afflict the meek and the confident alike, the dynamic and the introspective alike. It can come to the highly active and to the creative alike. Depression plays no favourites. It arrives in people's lives, sometimes following personal loss. It might be the grief over the lost relative. It might be a job loss. It might be a major crisis in some way in our life or tough times. But the depressive experience can strike very suddenly and very unexpectedly. It often follows a time of emotional exhaustion. But let's define the difference between depression and sadness. Depression is not just a sad episode. As I said, Jesus went through a couple of those that we have recorded for us. We all have times of worry and anxiety. But depression is different. It's reaching the point where you can't bounce back from your sadness, where the episodes become a spiral of negativity and a sense of hopelessness descends upon you. And it always contains a great sense of loss. It can be very disconcerting to some to find that they're losing control of their life and of their emotions. The man of the 21st century, the man judged to be the man of the 21st century, Winston Churchill, suffered from depression. He called it the black dog that kept coming back into his life. In the Bible, we have Asaph in Psalm 73, a leading Levite of the sons of Korah, leading the worship of the nation, but privately slipping into what he called a black hole of despair. So we have the depression defined for us. And these are some of the things that depression contains. A morose sadness or gloom, the black hole experience. No interest or pleasure in life. Unable to rejoice or to hope. Feelings of agitation or conversely lassitude and apathy. Now, you need to understand with depression that depending on your natural personality, it can affect you in quite different ways to other people. Some people get very agitated and always wanting to try and do something. Other people just want to do nothing. Tiredness, but unable to sleep properly. Always feeling tired, but can't sleep. It has some very odd effects upon people. Poor eating habits, loss of or gain of weight. So you find that there are quite contrary things to different people. Some people put on weight, some people won't eat, but always a sense of worthlessness. I am useless. I'm no good to anybody. Why would I want to stay alive? And of course, we know that depression obviously has some suicidal tendencies at times. You can't concentrate or focus, poor memory, and avoiding pressure or decision making. You know, these are the common symptoms of depression. There are more. Introversion, a consuming pity. Look what Baruch said in verse 3. Jeremiah quotes his own words back to him. You are saying, Baruch, woe is me, for Yahweh added grief to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighing. I find no rest. Did you notice the I's and the me's and the my's there? Here's a man that is completely self-pitying. Woe is me, woe is me. That's what you're saying, Baruch. So a consuming self-pity, driven by feelings rather than by reason. You know, he's upset because his ambitions have been dashed. His hopes are not going to come to pass. So he's feelings driven at this point, rather than reason that this has to be done. And people who are depressed, they want to be loved, but they will tell you, I want to be left alone. And that's a very key thing that carers must work out. When they say, leave me alone, they don't really mean it. What they're really saying is, I need your help, but they won't tell you that. And then sadly, psychosomatic illness often follows. When people are down in spirit, sometimes the body complies and they become ill in a physical sense. But the overwhelming thing about depression is the loss of meaning, the loss of the sense of worth or of value. Now, depression's not a new thing, brethren and sisters and young people, but it is much better and understood nowadays than it ever was. I want you to come to the 1st of Samuel. We'll look at 2 cases of depression in the Bible. And see, God puts very godly people in front of us who went through this terrible suffering of depression. And one of them is Hannah in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1. Bearing in mind those symptoms we've just put on the screen, just think what happened to Hannah. You know the situation, she can't have children. For a woman in Israel, that was a major loss of value. They saw themselves as creating the next generation for their husband. And she had the added burden of a second wife, who probably was under the law of inheritance. He had to take his brother's wife and raise seed, and she had many children. So we have Hannah, don't we? And she's going through a veritable, terrible time mentally. I want to say, when you look at Hannah, we're going to look at Elijah in a moment, it is not a sin to be depressed. Let's get that quite clear. It is not a sin to be depressed. It doesn't evidence a lack of faith. God, who knows how frail we are, has recorded faithful people like Hannah in the depths of sadness and to show us how they rose above it. Now here's Hannah doing her duty, going to the feast with her husband, probably helping Peninnah with her children. You can imagine what would have to happen in that household. And yet she's falling apart inside. Look at the obvious manifestation she had. Constantly weeping in verse 7. Therefore she wept and did not eat. So she's constantly weeping. She's got a loss of appetite. She wants to be alone. She refuses help. She withdraws even from her loved husband. She has a very strong focus upon herself and her problem. She says, I am bitter of soul. I want you to notice a very good lesson here, how not to help somebody who is depressed. As well intentioned as Elkanah was, he makes a classic mistake at the end of verse 8. Why aren't you eating? Why are you crying? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to thee than 10 sons? One thing you don't do is say to the depressed person, and particularly your wife, why should you be depressed? You've got me. That wasn't very good thinking, was it? You got me. He obviously was a good husband. He would have said that, but it wasn't what she needed. Eli then mistakes her for a drunk when she's praying to God. You see, he judged by outward appearances entirely. The woman's there, she's talking to herself. She must be a drunk. And he rebukes her, but she puts the matter in God's hands. So it is important to help in the right way. And we will talk at the end about helping in the right way. Another example is Job. We won't go there, but remember Job, what he went through, the loss of his children, the loss of his possessions, the loss of the support of his wife. And he says, I look for God on this side, look for God on that side. Look, I can't find where God is in all this. What's God doing with me? And he's very depressed. For 7 days, he sat in absolute silence. He was consumed by self-pity. Cursed be the day I was born, said Job. Why was I ever born? I might as well commit suicide. He went through all of those feelings. But at the end of it, brethren and sisters, he hung on to his faith. And he said, I know I'll come out refined like gold. Look at the life of David. You have the full cycle of human emotion in the life of David. Guilt, loneliness, fear, persecution complex. So many Psalms are written in a very bad frame of mind. And the classic in the Psalms is Asaph in Psalm 73. Felt himself slipping down towards the black hole, just trying to get a toehold before he goes over the edge into the gloom. It's a very common experience of feeling like you're just slipping away. And you can go through the Bible and you will find Jonah, John Mark, the Apostle Paul, King Saul, and a number of others go through classic depressions. Well, let's take Elijah. Come back to the 1st of Kings 19. Now, Elijah, as we said, had been on Mount Carmel, great courage to stand alone against the 850 prophets of Baal, but then he comes up face to face with Jezebel's unrepentance. Chapter 19 of 1st of Kings and verse 3. When the threat came from Jezebel that he would be destroyed by her, in verse 3, he rose and he went for his life. What an amazing thing that is. You know, here he is, he's emotionally drained. He's just run down the valley of Jezreel before the king's chariot. High hopes that the nation is going to see that God is active in their midst. And he runs into Jezebel. He ran away for himself. In verse 5, we see the classic symptoms. He sends away his servant. We see that in verse 3. He left his servant at Beersheba. You see, I want to be alone. Now, whether the servant here was Elisha or somebody else, we don't really know, but he had a servant. But he said, no, I don't want you here. Go away. Leave me alone. So you see, that desire to be alone, that's not always a good thing. I'll come back to that later on. But he wants to be alone. So there's a classic symptom of depression. A loss of appetite. He doesn't provide anything for food. He doesn't see the need for food. He's sleepy. All he wants to do is sleep. This journey that should have taken 6 days took 6 weeks. He'd walk a few kilometres, crash down under a tree in his gloom, and every time he woke up, there was an angel cooking for him. That angel didn't lecture him and say, what are you doing here? Where do you think you're going? Elijah, you need to eat. I've cooked a meal for you. And then he'd fall asleep again. Go a few more kilometres the next day and fall asleep again. It took him 6 weeks to get to Horeb. Should have been 6 days. You see, the man's totally depressed. He's nothing like the dynamic prophet that ran before the chariot. A sense of being alone. When he actually speaks to God, I only am left. I'm suicidal. Take my life away. I'm no use to anybody anymore. And you don't care. And the accusation is you don't care that I'm left alone. Depressed people are not always logical. Elijah certainly wasn't logical when he accused God of not caring. Where were the positive thoughts about the widow of Zarephath that had come into the truth? Where were the positive thoughts about the ravens that had fed him at the brook Kerith? Where were the positive thoughts about the fire that came down from heaven in answer to his prayer? Where was the appreciation for what Obadiah was doing with the prophets? Where was the appreciation for the rain that had come and then that had stopped and then come again at his bidding? But you see, the man's depressed. And that's why God has to slowly bring him out of it. And the whole process we saw last night of showing that God can work with other people was part of his ongoing education. But let's never underwrite the greatness of Elijah. The 2 people Jesus chose to be on the Mount of Transfiguration were Moses and Elijah. Let's never underestimate the greatness of Elijah. Let's go back to Baruch in Jeremiah 45 and see how God deals with his depression. Jeremiah 45. So remember, this is between the writing of the first scroll and the reading of the scroll that took place in the 5th year of Jehoiakim. We're going to see here how God deals with this man's depression. And you can trace this same pattern that God goes through in the case of Job, Elijah, Jonah, and Jesus with his own disciples. You can trace the same pattern of recovery that we go through here. But it's classic here in Jeremiah 45. And we're dealing with a God that understands the human mind better than any psychologist or any professional you might go to. He's the ultimate healer. And I do say, be a little cautious about today's psychiatry and psychology. There are not many that adopt a biblical perspective. I've known depressed people in our ecclesias to be told, well, don't bring your Bible with you when you come into the clinic. It won't do you any good. That's not good advice. Others say, well, you're a victim. And they create people a victim mentality. And then you get the worst of them that say, well, your problem is your religion. And I've read psychiatric reports that say exactly that. And they talk about a thing called religious trauma syndrome that you're suffering from. So be very cautious when you go to professionals in this world who are not using the Bible as a basis. Sometimes their advice will be, well, you look after yourself first. Don't worry about other people. They have to change around you. Look after number one and take more drugs. Go to therapy. There are not many that offer a spiritual component to progress. But we have God's method here in Jeremiah 45. The first step is feedback. Look what Jeremiah says. Verse 2, thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, unto thee, O Baruch. Now, Jeremiah hadn't heard these words. These were the words inside Baruch's heart. God had heard them. And now Jeremiah is given that information to repeat back to him. So the first thing is feedback. You know, the symptoms had been there in the case of Baruch. Woe is me. So, Baruch, what you're saying in your heart is, woe is me now. Yahweh's caused the problem. I'm fainting. I'm sighing. I can't go to sleep. He's a classic depressive, isn't he? So, but you are saying, woe is me. His name means the blessed of God, the blessed one. And he's saying, woe, woe, woe is me. And that's the consuming self-pity that you have with depression. The I, me, and the my statements always multiply. There's no focus on God's perspective in that. There's no solution or profit being addressed in those words. So feedback is the first element in helping somebody who's depressed. It is always useful to hear what we're actually saying. And when we hear it coming back from somebody else, it exposes the exaggerations that we've been inclined to make about how bad things are. Why did God say to Elijah, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah twice repeats his stubborn little speech about you don't care about me being alone, how unjust it is. Think of Jonah when the gourd covered him from the shade and then it died. Why are you angry, Jonah? And God is saying, you are angry. You got to analyze why you get angry. And God's drilling down to the problem by feedback of what he's actually doing and thinking himself. So number one is feedback. He's going to carefully feedback to somebody who's depressed, saying, now, tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you're saying inside your heart. And when they hear it for themselves, they start to realize how unreasonable it might be, how much it might have been exaggerated, and they begin to articulate their own solutions. And you'll hear comments like, well, I suppose I shouldn't think like that, and maybe I'm being a bit selfish in all this, but they've got to hear their own words. So number one is feedback, and that's what Jeremiah does. You are saying this. Number two is the reality check, and it's there in verse 4 and 5. Baruch, this is what Yahweh says to you. Behold, that which I have built, the temple, the city, will I break down. That which I planted, the nation, I will pluck up, even this whole land. Your problem, Baruch, is you are seeking great things for yourself. So Baruch had to face the reality check. Some things will not change. In fact, Baruch, it's going to get worse. It's all going to go. The nation, the temple, the people, God did not lie to him. He didn't say, look, it'll all be all right. It'll be okay. No, he didn't say that. It's going to get worse. But we don't know what the great things that he was seeking actually are. Maybe he had possessions, or maybe he had personal ambitions to be a prophet. But like all Jews, his national pride revolted at the thought of the temple being destroyed, of Gentiles conquering the nation of Israel. They just couldn't bear to think about that. And he was hoping if there was a national revival when these words were read out, that he would get an office as a great scribe and a great prophet in the nation. I might become a teacher or a prophet like Jeremiah. Whatever it was, he had ambitions. He was seeking great things for himself. And God's message to Baruch was very clear. Baruch, life is unfair. Life is hard. Life can be disappointing. But there's work to be done, Baruch. You know, sometimes depression arises from an unreal expectation of life. Our modern world promotes false images. The advertising industry uses movie stars, airbrushed images. And we're being conditioned to think that happiness can be bought by owning things. That life's all about fun and pleasure. The reality of life is often very different. People who go down the path of trying to find happiness by following the world's advertising get mired in debt. They lose relationships by chasing money. They end up frustrated, anything but happy and fulfilled. But even forgetting what the world does to its people, think about what happens in the truth. We are not promised unfettered happiness, perfect children, and easy times. The whole Bible tells you there will be conflict within and without as we try to raise spiritual thinking in our midst. And it's the last days, brethren and sisters. What do we expect the world to be like? What do we expect to happen in the ecclesia before the coming of Christ? There will be disappointments. There will be defections. There will be false prophets leading some astray. Our responsibility is to save those, the few, the remnant, who love the word. Like Elijah, to focus on the 7,000 that he'd been ignoring, those who would not bow the knee to Baal. So God says to Baruch, you've got work to do. Be grateful what you do have, Baruch. Look at verse 5. Don't seek great things for yourself. I will bring evil upon all flesh, says Yahweh. But here's something to be thankful for, Baruch. You will survive. I will give your life for a prey in all places whither thou goest. It's very needful when we're depressed to go back and to think about gratitude for what we do have. Jeremiah had been made a promise in chapter 15 and verse 11. When Jeremiah wanted to pray for the nation in chapter 14, God said, don't even bother to pray for them, Jeremiah. You're wasting your time. I won't listen to a prayer. I wouldn't care if Daniel was praying for them. You're wasting your time. What you've got to do, Jeremiah, is go and look after that little remnant. I've given you a remnant. I've given you a Sunday school class, a youth group. Work on them. They're the future. God says, don't pray for the nation. You're wasting your time. That promise about being preserved, of being a life for a prey, is found in 21 verse 9, 38 verse 2, and also in 39 verse 18. On 4 occasions, God says this, that I'll give you your life for a prey. See, what God was promising, that Jeremiah and his friends, his remnant, would not be killed by the Babylonians, nor would they be killed by the kings that wanted to persecute them. They might go through many frightening experiences, but they would survive. They would not be killed. Now, that little phrase, the life for a prey, is a Hebrew metaphor. You've probably all seen the David Rabbit films where, you know, the cheetah is chasing the little antelope, or the lion's chasing the wildebeest or something. And the little animal is going this way, getting knocked over and scarred by the lion's paw. But eventually he gets into the scrub and he's there panting and puffing and he's alive. And that's the Hebrew metaphor you've got here. Your life shall be a prey. You'll actually survive. You'll be knocked down. You'll be terrified. You'll be scarred, but you're alive. And that's why God says that 4 times in the book of Jeremiah. You will survive. And Baruch, you have to see that this side of the kingdom, life is a tapestry of good and evil mixed together. Be grateful for what you have. You've got the promises. You've got the guarantee of God's protection. You've got companions in the faith. The angels are looking after you. You've got spiritual understanding. And at the end, you've got the hope of the resurrection. Be thankful for what you do have. And that's how God restored Baruch. And so he got up and he read chapter 36, verse 9. Just go back there again. It came to pass in the 5th year of Jehoiakim, in the 9th month, they proclaimed a fast. And in verse 10, then read Baruch in the book the words of Jeremiah in the house of Yahweh, and so forth. And it was a dramatic impact that he had upon a number of people. But you see, he recovered himself from his depression. God had brought him back from the edge of the pit of despair. Now, I want to just talk firstly to carers, for people who get involved in trying to help the depressed, because as Elkanah found out, it's not always easy. Don't despise the depressed. You know, there are times we get unsympathetic to people who are depressed. It's a complex illness. It often takes a long time to heal. There are no magic cures. It's no good saying to somebody, come on, snap out of it, because willpower will not solve it. I have known people who are some of the most determined and confident people you could imagine, ending up depressed and sitting on their bed and crying for weeks. It needs a gradual refocusing on what life is really about, upon God and his ways. And it requires support and patience. There will be relapses. People will come to a certain stage and then they will relapse. It needs time. And one of the most important things is not to accept them saying, I want to be left alone. It's important just to be there, to keep contact, to send messages, cards, letters, calls. Think of that angel that cooked patiently for Elijah for 6 weeks. Every time Elijah woke up, there's a meal ready for you. Didn't lecture him. He was always there for 6 weeks. What a job that angel had for 6 weeks, just patiently looking after Elijah. I know of a case where there was an older brother who was very depressed and even a little bit suicidal. And so one of his friends in the ecclesia, against the brother's wishes, he came every day to his house, knocked on the door and said, I know you don't want to talk. And this brother would lie curled up on his couch. And the visiting brother would come and he said, well, I'm just going to sit here and read the Pioneers. So he read through his Pioneer works for quite a while. And they never said anything because he didn't want to talk. And then one day he turned over and said, what are you reading there? And away they went from there. And the brother was eventually restored back to full health out of his depression. But you see, he was there. And that was the point of the angel, wasn't it? He was there when Elijah woke up. Support is vital. You've got to listen to what they're saying and feedback, and don't lecture them. And you don't add your own worries and your own experiences. One of the least helpful things is to talk about yourself, as much as we all love to do that. It's not going to help the depressed person to hear how wonderfully you get through depression. Feedback is important. What God did for Elijah, what God did for Baruch, starts the self-corrective process that they need to go through. Remember Jesus on the road to Emmaus. He comes across 2 disciples standing in the middle of the road, arguing. And he says to them, why are you sad? He knew why they were sad. But you see, he got them to actually tell him why they were sad. You've got to get those feelings out in the open. That's the feedback process. Then we have to listen carefully. We've got to empathize without indulging. This is God's way of doing things, and this is where God's wisdom and modern wisdom often diverge. Realities have to be faced. Sometimes circumstances will not change. There are professionals who tell people, you have a right to stay depressed. Others have to change first before you come out of your gloom. Look after yourself first. It's not what God says. God says you need to keep moving and doing the right things. And nobody is spared the hard tasks. Remember the occasion Jeremiah said, I've heard the men of Anathoth want to kill me. I want to resign. I don't want this job anymore. Did God empathize with him and say, oh, you poor fellow? God said, Jeremiah, you've been running on level ground against men. You're now going to run against horses. You thought it was hard in the days of Josiah? Well, you tried Jehoiakim and see how you get on. God was not sympathetic. There was work to be done. It's going to get harder, Jeremiah. Every time he resigned, God said, Jeremiah, I hear what you're saying, but get down to the temple and make this speech. So some things will not change. You empathize. So sad that you're like this, but you don't indulge. Don't say they have a right to stay like this. Open the scriptures. As I said, we had a case where a person was advised not to take their Bible when they went into the depression clinic. We can't neglect the one source of real comfort and wisdom where life gets tough. At the end of Asaph in Psalm 73, he said, it is good for me to draw nigh unto God. He realized that by going into the sanctuary, he was readjusting his mind against the depression. And carers must always be putting in the word in season to him that is weary. You've got to know how to do that. What to say, the right things to say to people who are depressed and cast down. How to speak a word in season to him that is weary is a very, very important talent. And we don't make hasty judgments. Look at Eli judging Hannah by her outward appearances. Look at Job's friends. Loyal, but wrong, called miserable comforters. They weren't saying the right things about God or Job. One thing you must do as a carer is not try and interpret providence for the wounded soul. Well, this has happened to you because 10 years ago you said something to one of my relatives. Well, it doesn't work like that, does it? You don't try and interpret providence for the wounded soul. Look what Elihu did. It was so different to the friends of Job. Number one, he listened carefully. He then gave Job feedback on the words that Job was saying. Job, you are saying this and this and this. Do you really mean that? He opened Job's mind to think outside of himself and prepared him for God's coming in the whirlwind and giving that final speech. Elihu was a good counselor. So for the depressed, well, there are many things the depressed need to think about doing, and we've got to think these things through before we actually go into that pit of despair. Be willing to express the feelings. One of the best bits of advice I ever read on this subject was from somebody who had been in the black hole themselves. And they said this, there will be no coming out of the depths as long as you prefer to stay in them. I'll say that again, there will be no coming out of the depths as long as you prefer to stay in them. Depression can become a comfort zone for some people. They cut themselves off from other people, they avoid their responsibilities, they defer decisions. If you want to stay there, it's going to be much harder. So be willing to talk about it. Don't internalize it. Express your feelings. If you just stay inside yourself, you get a consuming self-pity. You know, we haven't got time to go to Jeremiah 20, but Jeremiah gets to the point where he says, I'm just like Job. I wish I'd never been born. But at least he's raging against God, and God can answer him. It's better to get it out in the open. Say what is really driving you into that black hole. Talk about it. Lay it before God. You know, there's a man in Psalm 42 and 43 who's cut off from the worship in Jerusalem in the days of that terrible king that put up the calves at Bethel, Jeroboam. And that man is praying, and his prayer is saying to God, I want to go to Jerusalem. I can't get there. And he's very upset and very depressed. Better to lay it out before God. Continue in prayer. You know, James says, is any sad? Let him pray. Paul prayed 3 times over the thorn in the flesh that he had. Asaph went into the sanctuary. Don't ignore prayer when we're depressed. Even the Lord Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, I don't know what to pray for. What shall I pray for? He's got a great conflict in his mind between the cross and his responsibility. And prayer is not easy when you're depressed. But never think that you have to be in a perfect frame of mind, that your thoughts have to be perfectly sorted out before you can go to God. Because the Psalms are full of verses that tell us that God hears confused and distressed prayers as much as the eloquent, structured prayers. In Lamentations chapter 3, when Jeremiah is lamenting the fall of Jerusalem, in the first 19 verses, you get 35, I, me, and my's. And then he goes on beyond that to greater things. And accept the reality, things may not change. Job would always miss the children he'd lost. Grief would not go away. When Jeremiah complains about his lot, God's answer was, go stand in the temple and make another speech. We've got to believe that in the end, God will wipe away all tears from our eyes. And we have to learn to count our blessings. And of Yahweh's mercies, we're not consumed. His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. We have to learn to count our blessings. Would you just come to Lamentations chapter 3? What's time this morning tea, by the way? Now, is it? Oh, okay. Right, okay. We'll quickly summarise that. We won't go to Lamentations chapter 3. So let's just summarise the other things. Lamentations 3 said, "It's good that a man should hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. Lift up your heads." You know, Jeremiah came to realise in his own Lamentations, when he collapsed and when Jerusalem fell, the people were carted away. He was very depressed. But Yahweh will not cast off forever. Though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. He doth not afflict willingly nor grieve the children of men. And so Jeremiah worked himself out of depression by considering and being grateful for the things that God had given. So when you're depressed, count your blessings. Express gratitude to God. Look outwardly and think of others. Asaph said, "I can't go public with my doubts. I would offend the children of my people." So think of other people and what you might be able to do for them. And keep active and involved. Even the world will tell you that. Get out there and do something positive. And so Baruch got up and he read the scroll. What was the response? Well, he read it and the king burnt it. We know what happened. The king grabbed the scroll, put it in the fire, and it was gone. He had to write it all out again, and more words were added. So let's leave you with this quotation that I found incredibly useful. Depression is not a sign that God has abandoned us. It's more likely a sign that God is getting to work on us for our ultimate good.